everyone, this is Jennifer Beamer, owner-operator of Expedite Dyed Art by Science, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience making a tablet woven border on my experimental warp weighted loom piece. Hey everyone! First thing I wanted to do before I got into the threads was to let you guys know that I appreciate you subscribing, liking my videos, making comments, and sharing it around the interwebs. And if you're new here, thank you for joining me in this video. And if you have any other questions or comments, you can put that down below. I also have lots of other videos and playlists for you to watch as well. If you're curious, you can support me in lots of ways, first of which is just by subscribing and liking my videos to let the YouTube algorithm know that you like this content, and so you can see more YouTube creators like me. But also, I get a little bit of ad revenue every single time you watch one of my videos. Furthermore, if you want to support me through the work that I do with my shop at expeditedyed.com, or the same on Etsy, feel free to go to expeditedyed.com and check out my web shop where I've got lots of different supplies like bats and yarn, and hopefully I'll have some more knitted items in the shop once I get that underway. So there were a lot of ways I think I could have introduced this particular topic, and I actually debated back and forth how I was going to create the title for this, because it's actually a very specific point I wanted to talk about, and it's not a very catchy title. So if you've watched some of my past live streams, you'll know that I was breaking in a new tool. I bought myself a warp weighted loom because I wanted to do some experiments last year, and because of the pandemic, I didn't get a chance to do that. Video up here. So whenever you get a new tool, you definitely want to spend some time acquainting yourself with it. How does it work? How do you respond to the various quirks of whatever equipment that you're using? And so that's what I wanted to do during those live streams, because it was sort of an off-the-cuff, let's see how this goes, but I also wanted to share it with you guys because I know some of you have come to my channel through my Iron Age Textiles series. So this is kind of a follow-up to that content. If you watched those live streams, you probably heard me talking about having company coming to visit, and that was true. I had to very quickly finish this piece of cloth that I was experimenting with. And so what I wanted to do, instead of doing a live stream where the video quality might not be as good, I wanted to just sit down and show you some footage of the actual process that I went through, but I also wanted to start off by talking about kind of the tools that I was using, and also a little bit about the history of this particular approach. So for those of you who don't know much about warp weighted loom technology, essentially it is a way of producing a piece of fabric where you use warp weights or loom weights as the main tensioning device. If you're curious to see how this works in action, I do have some other live streams that I can refer you to so that you can kind of get a sense of what it is that I'm talking about as a legitimate setup. In those live streams, you can actually see how I was using everything in conjunction, but also in those videos, you might be able to see that I've got a starting border at the top that is made with tablets. So I made a tablet woven starting border to capture all of my warp threads, and then the loom weights were at the other end serving as my tensioning tool. And so when you're weaving a piece of fabric like this, the top edge is bound. The selvages on either side are also bound, but when you get to the bottom, you have some choices. Now, in the past, what I would do is I would just cut off the warps, and then I would do a rolled hem and then stitch it into place with just a basic whip stitch. I was less curious about that element when I was doing my other experiments because they were very research motivated. But with my recent couple of live streams, when I was just trying to get used to this new warp weighted loom that I bought, I wanted to kind of throw caution to the wind and just experiment with lots of different ideas. And so I changed some variables, which usually you don't want to do unless you have a good reason to do that. So what I did was I changed the thread density by using thinner threads, but I still used the same loom weights that I used in previous experiments. And in addition to changing that variable, I wanted to see, well, what would happen if I used either a sword beater for some of the weft picks, or if I used a long-handled comb and as a weft beater. And I kind of alternated back and forth with that, and then I decided at the very end I'm going to mirror that tablet woven border at the top with the same thing at the bottom, therefore creating a bounded piece of cloth that was woven with selvages in mind, so I could literally just take it off the loom and it would be ready to use. In theory. All of this is with the caveat that it's in theory. Now, I will show you more specifically what I'm talking about later in this video, how the theory and the practice sometimes don't always line up. But I wanted to show you what I was using in the video. So these are my tablets. I actually don't know what they're made of. They're probably pine, and they're based off the Oseberg tablets. And I think I have 10 of these in total, but I'm using some of them for other things. I have this one here. I didn't have a small shuttle at the time, so I used this other tablet as a little mini shuttle. It's very cute. Anyway, so if you see me using these, that's what they are. I don't have the really big ones that some people will get that have also like numbers or letters, or it might even be color coded. And they're also quite small. I honestly don't know why I got them, because I probably should have gotten a bigger set to make all of this a lot easier, but Sometimes when you experiment, you don't necessarily want to commit all of the materials or resources into checking to see whether your idea is actually going to succeed or has the potential of succeeding. Because if you're a hand maker, you know that sometimes it's really worth checking your gauge in your knitting or counting your warps again before you start your weaving project. So I kind of did the same thing with this, but it was actually for a different reason. I needed to prove to myself that theoretically it would not be possible to get a greater density of yarns with a tablet woven border with one of my earliest set of experiments. And so this is what made me ditch that idea, but it's a really great learning tool. Okay, what the heck are you looking at? So, the tablets here, they are holding these threads on one end. I can't remember which one. I think it might have been this end. Now, I can't tell you which end I started with, but what I can tell you is I would have worked this way, where these loops are indicative of where the warp would go. So imagine these loops extended out 2 meters or something. So each of these loops is comprised of 2 yarns that I've held together and pulled through. So maybe you can see that. So in order to get the right density, I would have to figure out something else for this band here. So I abandoned this idea, but this was the test that I did to make sure I understood how to make a tablet woven starting band and to understand how the turning of the tablets can actually impact how firmly you can squeeze the warps into that space. So the warps actually serve as the weft of the tablet woven band. So I went back to it later when I did the wool, and actually there's a major difference between how wool reacts to this process rather than linen. So this is linen, and hopefully in the future, when I have more time, I'll actually be able to revisit this idea because I have another video plan for the future that kind of gets back to more of the experimental archaeology aspects of weaving with Iron Age tools. This example also lets you know what the other end looks like, but these would not remain looped at the other end. So to separate the front shed from the back shed, because I was just doing a plain tabby weave, I ended up cutting these loops. And so these warp yarns with the loop cut at the end, these would then serve as the weft threads of the parallel woven border that would go on the very end. Now on to the physical evidence. What is the evidential basis that we have for having a tablet woven border to begin with and also to end with? I have this wonderful book, and it's got in the very back a set of 2 appendices, one for the Bronze Age, one from the Iron Age of the Hallstatt textiles. And it's a really great resource. This was not a very cheap book. Hopefully you'll be able to find a copy of it somewhere and get a chance to take a look. But they've got these really amazing plates in there where you can actually see the textile. Oftentimes there will be some kind of schematic breakdown illustration. There's some technical details about the spin direction, what it's made out of, a degree of twist. There might be some bibliography information, and there's some key notation at the top that's really useful. But I looked through this to see if there were any ending tablet woven borders. Now, most of the time what you will get in this catalog is bits of fragment pieces, so from the middle of a textile. Sometimes you'll get things like hems or seams, which are really fascinating actually to look at. Sometimes you'll get a bit of the tablet woven border that started the piece of fabric and a bit of the woven part, so we know that it is the start of the pattern. And then we also will get just like pieces of belt fragments, so there's no indication that it was used specifically to bind the top edge of warp-weighted loom fabric. So given that there's no evidence from at least Austria during the Bronze and Iron Ages, it kind of poses this question to us. Well, do Iron Age people in Britain use this method? Because actually the number of textiles that we have from that time period, which is what I researched for my PhD, there isn't as much. And in total, the evidence is much smaller. So there's a lot of large fragments from Hallstatt, and the fragments that we have for the British Iron Age are exceptionally tiny. So it would be really difficult to make that kind of similar comparison. But maybe we should look to a later period. So if you're not already familiar with Marta Hoffman and you haven't checked out the link that I posted below, then maybe you're familiar with her book, which she wrote after her PhD thesis work. And it is an invaluable research project that also includes some modern ethnographies of people in Norway who were either doing this on occasion or maybe they knew about it because they watched their mother or grandmother making fabric this way and sort of inherited the tools, but maybe didn't have the same level of understanding. So it's kind of like it was starting to become a lost art by the time Marta Hoffman did her ethnography work. So a lot of the stuff that you see recorded in those ethnographies are sort of taken with a slight grain of salt. Because some of them are more adept at using the technology than others. But it's definitely one of those things worth looking at, because you get to see also how different groups of people have adapted the knowledge of this technology to sort of fit their particular life ways. So that out of the way, there was one thing that I wanted to point out, and it's on page 169 of the 1974 publication of that book, where you have the Tegel find, which is a depiction of spraying, actually not warp weighted loom technology, but there's a depiction of spraying here. And what's important about this is you actually see a tablet woven bind off, essentially. And so this is kind of what I am using in this experiment, if you will, exploratory experimentation. But this is 3rd, 4th century AD. And so there is some possible way of saying that there might have been this type of knowledge during the latest parts of Iron Age British history. So the Iron Age end point really corresponds with the Roman invasion at 43 AD. And so it's really not that much of a stretch to say that these techniques might not... Wait, how did I start that sentence? I don't think it would be a stretch of the imagination to presume that finishing with a tablet woven border in this way wouldn't have been possible, because I think it absolutely could have been possible. Whether Iron Age people actually use this technique to finish their cloths is anyone's guess. Those are just a couple of the examples that I have here to work with. And so I have one example saying, yes, it's possible, and obviously the first one sort of indicating that's probably not, although it's really hard to say because we don't know anything about how all the textiles were used and whether all textiles might have been bound in the same way or not, and if they had a variety of ways of ending a piece of warp-weighted cloth, then we may not have as much potential for preservation because we have a higher percentage of starting borders in the record, which is probably indicative of these pieces of fabric being warped in the exact same way every time, but not necessarily finished in the exact same way every time. But that's one of the tricky things with archaeological textile studies, is we're working with a lot of assumptions, and sometimes they may be good or not so good, but sometimes we don't know if they're going to be good assumptions until we look at the evidence more. So because I was very restricted to a particular time period and area of Britain, I don't have the knowledge of, 100 textile scholars. So from my research, it seems to point towards that ending edge not really being present in Bronze and Iron Age textiles, but I could be wrong. As I mentioned earlier in the video, this experiment that I was doing was not for research. This was partially for me to understand this new loom that I had, and also to experiment with some ideas so that I could pick up on research questions that I hadn't thought about previously that actually might be really relevant. One of the things I was doing was, of course, breaking in this tool, but I was also curious to see how far I could push the threads of my setup until maybe they broke. If you're at all familiar with the Center for Textile Research and some of the experiments that they've done over the last 8 years or so, you'll probably know that there's like this optimal weaving setup with the warp-weighted loom, and that has to do with the amount of tension applied to your warp threads. So they suggest anywhere between 10 to 30 grams of warp tension per thread is optimal. Upwards of 40 to 50 grams per thread. However, it might result in a lot of tension on the threads and might make it a little bit more difficult to actually do the weaving process. So there's potentially lots of reasons why 10 to 30 grams is optimal from a weaving experience. And the weaver that is often associated with these works is Ira Dumont. I trust that she knows what she's doing and she's very good at what she does because all of the fabrics look beautiful and I've seen them in person, and she's also a very humble person, so she's always got an A in my book. Now, I wanted to see how this would work if I pushed it up into the 60, 70, 80 grams of tension range, because I'm a scientist at heart and I want to know what that top level is. Like, how much weight can you put on a single thread in this weaving setup before it becomes impossible to do the task? Now, I'm not a weaver, I'm a spinner and a dyer. And so my rationale with this is, if I can get it to work, then it's probably the case that Iron Age people could have used a setup similar to this and succeeded probably better than me. So again, assumption, but I want to give them credit where it's due. So when I set up this experiment, it was 88 grams of tension per thread. 88 grams. And actually, it turned out just fine. So I didn't have any warp breakages, but I did have a couple of instances where I accidentally caught a thread with my sword beater and didn't realize it and then pushed on it, and so I broke it. But that only happened twice, and it was more just because the first time I didn't put more twist back into that single for the warp, and then it broke again because it got a little loose. Those mistakes aside, I was actually able to weave a piece of fabric. The last thing I wanted to do with this particular experiment, exploratory experiment, was to also play with the idea of having this tablet woven border at the bottom. I had a thought that something was going to go wrong, and it did. In this portion of the video, I wanted to show off the established pattern at first so that you got a sense of what my hands are doing, because it's a very small space where I'm working. So here I'm just showing you the established pattern where the threads have already been woven into the tablet band at the bottom. And in this section you can see how the warp has been woven as the weft. Next to it is the section that I'm going to start weaving. And so what I'm doing is the previous warp that has now been the weft, I'm going to loop that through the opening between the tablets. That's the working shed. And it makes this little loop so that I can pull it taut after I turn the tablets. And then, because I started with 2 threads through the top, I need to finish with 2 threads in the bottom. So I'm taking the warp that is now becoming the weft, and I'm threading that down through, so there's the the looped end is going through that shed, and also the new weft is going through that shed. So I've rotated the cards, cinched everything down, and now I'm going to pull that loop to the edge, like that. And you can see how that's following the same pattern that I showed earlier in this section of the video. And then in theory, it should pretty much look identical to my starting border here that I'm showing you. And if I turn this around so you can see the other side, you can see this is what you might call the front side of the fabric. And there's just, it looks pretty seamless. It looks like those warps that have now become the wefts, they kind of just dissolve into the border. And it's kind of because they do. And so what you're left with are all of these warp ends that have been threaded through the tablets as the weft. And so they're pretty secure in this state, which makes it a pretty decent way to bind the selvage. And to give you a broader view of what my hands are doing, I've kind of zoomed out slightly so you can see the tablets. And it's really important with this process to grab the adjacent warp. I spent a lot of time early on just double checking my work so that I didn't accidentally jump one of my warps, because if that happens, they get crossed, and that can actually distort the weave right below where the tablet woven border is. And I didn't want that, so I had to work with enough caution so that I didn't make a mistake. Going back to fix a mistake is definitely not something I'm good at yet, so I didn't want to work too quickly, so I erred more on the side of caution. When you see me separating these tablets, I'm just making sure that I'm positive the sheds are unstuck and they're not catching on anything, so that whenever I turn the tablets the next time, all of the threads turn in the way that they're supposed to. Like I said, I'm not very good at this aspect, so I can't really go back and fix mistakes. So by being a little bit more cautious at the beginning, I can just make sure that I don't make mistakes in the first place. Although I probably made mistakes, but I tried really hard not to make any initially. So if there are any mistakes, they're just teachable moments. By this time, I think I had been working on it for probably close to an hour. I've slightly sped up a little bit in this section so you can kind of see more at a realistic pace. But again, I was still going slow so that you can see the full effect. If it looks time consuming, it's because it was. In this part, you can actually see where this was attached to the top beam, where the tablet woven border was a little bit wobbly. Now that you've seen the footage, you probably have a greater sense of what it was I was trying to describe in the beginning of this video. But essentially, I wanted to have a mirrored starting border and ending border with the two side selvages produced so that I could just have a piece of fabric that I didn't have to do any other finishing to complete it. And so I have here the finished version, and most of the time when I do these experiments, I want to make at least a meter, meter and a half. Really, I aim for about 2 meters, but sometimes timing doesn't work out and it has to go a little bit shorter than that. This one is actually the shortest sample that I've done to date, which was only 0.6 meters. But it did help me understand a few things about the weaving process and some things to bear in mind for the next experiment. So you can see here, this is that nice tablet woven border that I started with, and then the weaving continues. And I don't know if it'll pick it up on here or not, but it's actually really starting to get wispy on the edges, and my weaving seems to get closer and closer to the middle. But I wanted to show you this really wonky edge. What is happening here? Well, I will tell you. I started with this edge here. You can actually see I've brought the threads up here and then I've folded them to the back side. Which is why there's a little bit of the warps still kind of poking out there. I did that on purpose because I wanted, I didn't want to cut it too short, and then I washed it so I could trim it afterwards, and obviously I didn't trim it afterwards because I got to this part and it completely fell apart. But when I was filming, I basically filmed up until about here. And then my camera was starting to die, right? I filmed till about here. And then it was going to be a lot faster if I didn't have to worry about going slow so you could see what my hands are doing. And so I sped up a little bit more because it needed to be done as well. Right here, this part in the middle. So what's happened is the threads have kind of shimmied towards the middle, and so they're less dense on the edges, more dense in the middle, but it's really difficult to see that. Maybe you can see here if I push it against the wall behind me, you can see a little bit of the white coming through. But the density of the threads here, the cover factor is more open, whereas here in the middle, the cover factor is higher because it's the threads are much closer together. And so this is actually one of the things that I ran into in terms of trouble, because these threads, instead of coming straight up into the band, they were kind of grouped so tightly together here that the band I was weaving kept advancing, but I was still pulling the warps from here. So if I was working, my working space was over here, so I was trying to have to pull these warps up into the weft of my tablet woven border, and obviously that's going to cause some puckering, which is what I have here, is this little bit that's puckered out. Maybe you can even see that. You can see how the weft has gotten really loose in that spot. So yeah, you can see how the weft has gotten really loose in this spot. And it's because I was sort of yanking those warps to kind of straighten it out a little bit. And it got like way worse by the end, and like it now sticks out from the fabric more right there, if you can see. So because it sticks out, it looks really, really loose, where actually when I finished weaving the fabric, it was a perfectly straight line. It just, the warps in the middle were a little closer to each other and the warps on the edges were more spread out. And I don't know how to fix this. So if you are familiar with warp-weighted loom weaving and using singles rather than plied yarns, let me know, because there's actually some differences between how I think singles behave versus plied yarns behave, and also thread gauge. So this yarn was 0.3 millimeters in diameter, which is actually quite fine. And so at the start here, basically up until about here, the fabric is quite perfectly 10 warps by 10 wefts per centimeter. And that actually categorizes this fabric, according to Marguerite Huld, as a fine textile. And if you're comparing Bronze Age versus Iron Age extant textiles, Bronze Age textiles tend to be more coarse, all singles, no plied yarns, and they tend to be somewhere in the ballpark of 2.5 threads by 4 or 5 threads in the warp and weft per centimeter. So that's really quite coarse. And then they can get upwards of fine balance to their 10 warps by 10 wefts. So with my heavy loom weights from Danebury Hill Fort that weigh 1,750 grams, they're whoppers. I've been able to show that 30-degree twist singles can support 88 grams of tension and actually produce a really nice piece of fabric. So I think it's worth revisiting in the future. However, I need to work out this issue of what makes these warp threads want to congregate more towards the middle, and how to kind of get them distributed more evenly. Because my loom weights, it doesn't matter if I have the heavy loom weights on the outside that weigh 1,750 grams, or if I put those same loom weights in the middle, because I've tried both now and they produce the exact same problem. So I think it's a weaver error and not necessarily because the setup just doesn't work. So if you could have different setups and produce the same error, I think it's probably because of something that I'm doing or not doing. So if you have a thought, please let me know. I know I mentioned this in the first part of the video, but I didn't actually show you an example. This is a long-handled comb, and this is a replica of one of the combs I examined in my PhD thesis from Danebury Hill Fort. And I had these commissioned, I have 3 of them. I had them commissioned by a craftsperson. I don't really know what they're used for. It's one of the things that I argued in my thesis. I wanted to see how effective they would be with making cloth. And so, if you think this is going to solve my problem, please let me know in the comments below, because especially if you're a weaver or if you've used anything like this, I think your insights are going to be extremely valuable. And if this has helped you, if you could also link with a video or some photos of you doing this, that would be even better. And for anyone else who has tried to do something similar to this, I'm sure it's going to be very important for them to see it as well. So if you want to share it with us, we would be grateful. In conclusion, I learned quite a lot from this exploratory experimentation. So the first thing that I think was really important for me was realizing that we still haven't quite hit that upper bound of what heavy loom weights can really do. And so if you are an ancient weaver and maybe you don't have the space or the desire to have multiple loom weight sets, you might actually just devise one set that can do lots of different types of fabrics and something that you can use for wool and also linen. So I think this kind of broadens that general research question I have. And the second thing that this has done has made me value this tool as a weft beater a little bit more, because I think there's something to do with how I can use it to manage the spacing of the warps as I'm weaving. But I don't really have the weaver's intuition, because I think I've only done about 8 experiments with a warp weighted loom. One of the goals that I have after doing all the thesis stuff and all the corrections and then living through December working 2 jobs basically full time, I now want to actually get back to preparing something for my next experiment. And this one's going to be a little bit more research focused than this one was. But I want to use this experimental process to kind of revisit some of the insights I've gotten from my exploratory research. So if you have some thoughts or other resources I'm not familiar with, then please let me know. If you have made it to the end of this video, you are an awesome person. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have other ideas for other types of videos, tutorials, fiber talk, whatever, let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye! Layla. Yeah. I love my cat, like all cat moms, but she has a tendency to be very loud, bitey, and she likes to chew on things. So unfortunately I have to banish her whenever I do these videos. Oh, and I thought I'd be cheeky and put something cute in the background. And this is prime stuff for her to chew on.